And he says, how is it that you know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times? Pastor Harv, will you talk about the signs of the times for a little bit?
So Mark, are you saying that Jesus says that we have a pretty good handle on what's going on in our life today, but we're kind of clueless to what's going to happen in the future? Is that the point he's trying to make?
Maybe we're clueless, or maybe we just don't want to believe it.
Okay. I was hoping that you'd agree with me. Otherwise, what I'm getting ready to say is not going to make any sense.
Maybe we should have got together and put this together.
So here are the two most important events in the last days. We're going to keep this simple. Number one, Jesus is coming again. And when we look around the world today, it's pretty easy to see that his coming is closer than it's ever been before. And number two, God, at the very end, is going to create a new heaven and a new earth where believers will rule and reign with him forever. Listen, church, the reason we need to be informed about the last days is so that we can be ready to meet Jesus when he comes, but also to remind ourselves that the only thing that will transition from this life into the new heaven and the new earth are those things that are eternal. Everything else is going to go up in smoke. Again, I don't say that to scare you. I say it because it is the most important reality in our life as believers. That's why we need to act light and adjust our lives to this truth. Now, surrounding the time that Jesus returns, as the world gets closer to the end, things are going to go from bad to worse. Things are going to get really bad. And as believers, we may be already in heaven with Jesus, or we might still be here on earth. But during this period of time that we refer to as the tribulation, things are going to be a whole lot worse than they are today. And during this time of tribulation, there will be one specific event that will happen that will very concisely draw the lines between good and evil forever. And we need to be informed about this strategic moment in the end times. As believers, we really do need to be informed about the last days. Here's why. Because Satan will deceive many through a counterfeit Messiah. Check this out. In 2 Thessalonians 2, 3-4, Paul says, "Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day, the day of Christ's return, will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed." This verse causes believers to feel like the event that we're going to talk about is a major event in the last days and needs to happen for many believers in their theology before Christ returns. The man of lawlessness, doomed to destruction, he will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. So who is this scoundrel? Who is this guy, Mark?
Thanks.
Yeah, leave it with you.
Who is the Antichrist? Well, that ought to be easy. Actually, I have narrowed it down for you, and I've made this little video. Will you go ahead and show the video? Jesus is saying here that endurance, stick-with-itness, is the mark of true salvation. So that kind of helps us when the apostasy comes. The true mark of salvation is if we have that endurance to keep believing when nobody else is believing, if we have the stick-with-itness to go on, even if we become a persecuted group of people. He continues on. He says, all during this time, the good news, the message of the kingdom will be preached all over the world. A witness staked out in every country. And then the end will come. Skipping all the way down to verse 15, Jesus says, but be ready to run for it when you see the monster of desecration set up in the temple sanctuary. The prophet Daniel described this, Jesus says. If you've read Daniel, then you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay then, Jesus, Let's go all the way back to Daniel and see what in the world Jesus is talking about. We'll go to Daniel chapter 7. And just for the fun of it, we'll start in verse 23. By the way, during this passage, Daniel is actively and lucidly being led through a vision by an angel of God, whom this translation calls the bystander. So this is what he says. He's talking about the Antichrist. Then he, the Antichrist, will blaspheme the Most High God, persecute the followers of the High God, and try to get rid of sacred worship and moral practice. God's holy people will be persecuted by him. Sounds bad, doesn't it? But there's a happy ending. In verses 26 and 27, Daniel continues, or the bystander, the angel continues, but when court comes to order, he will be stripped of his power and totally destroyed. Which reinforces what the Apostle Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 8, where Paul says, and then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow by the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming. Literally, in the Greek, he basically says, whom Jesus will come in, blow away upon his glory and upon his coming. So, yes, all cultures and all religions have had some belief in the end of time. Yes, the Judeo-Christian religion and tradition has a belief in a second coming. And that second coming is going to have an apostasy and the revealing of the Antichrist with it. And God has had this plan set in place for a long, long time. What we know is that at some point in human history, a political, religious figure will rise up and oppose God to his face. In 2 Thessalonians 2, in verse 4, it says, he will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worship, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. He may come and say, all of the religions on earth are wrapped up and put together in me. And so he takes reign of every religion and culture on the earth and says, I am what you've been worshiping from the dawn of time, and sets himself up to be God. You know, some people say this has already happened. Scholars and biblical historians who are kind of out there on the fringes will tell you that what Daniel prophesied about somebody coming and setting himself up in the temple already happened. For instance, when people would come and conquer Jerusalem and conquer Israel, their favorite thing to do was to go and look at this awesome temple because it was plated with gold and beautifully adorned on the inside and on the outside. So they'd come and visit. And actually, in 168 BC, Antiochus III, called Epiphanes, showed up in Jerusalem, walked into the temple of God and said, I am your God. And then in 63 BC, General Pompey of the Roman army came into the temple, opened up the curtains to the Holy of Holies, and looked in and said, what's the big deal? The Emperor Caligula was actually going to have a statue of himself placed in the Holy of Holies, but then he died before the construction could begin. So some would say, well, this has already happened 3 times. Yes, it happened 3 times before Jesus came on the scene. So when Jesus came and prophesied that the Anarchist or the Antichrist would come and set himself up in the temple, knowing that these events had happened currently, said that those events were not the event that I'm talking about. The event that I'm talking about has yet to come. Which presents a problem, doesn't it? Will the real Antichrist please stand up so that we can